Welcome to the launch of Journeys in the Shadow Private Rented Sector, a research report examining the nature and impact of criminality by landlords and letting agents, and making recommendations for urgent changes to law, policy and practice. Our first speaker, Lacey, gives us a first-hand account of her tenant experience in the Shadow PRS.
My name is Lacey Adigu. I'm a 39-year-old mother of two beautiful children, a 6-year-old and a 17-year-old. I'm presently giving testimony for the experiences I have had regarding a housing system that has failed me amongst many, many others. I left home aged 15 as I spent a short stint of time in care. Following this, I spent the next 4 years residing in various hostels. There were no counselling services to access at that time. The properties were not always sanitary. Safety wasn't always guaranteed. Age 17, I once woke up to a gun pointed at my face, which resulted in an emergency move to a boys' shared house, far away from friends and the little family I was then in touch with. During my time there, my younger brother and sister came to live with me as my mother was suffering from alcoholism. I was ushered into this responsibility doing whatever I could, experiencing degradation and such things so that I may continue to send my siblings to school for food, etc. I moved to my first flat via a housing association. I was in a studio flat for 8 years, during which time, after a robbery, a sexual assault, then becoming pregnant, an overdue termination of a baby at 6 months, a year of isolation, then the birth of my first child, I was operating on survival. I went to uni, unable to keep up with my work due to the confines of space, and realised that I was never going to be moved. I didn't have the confidence to face the resistance I was experiencing from my housing officer to fight. I felt like I deserved it as I had rent arrears at the time due to not wanting to engage with job centre employees who were particularly harsh and unreserved with their disdain of those on the side of the table that I would sit on. My housing benefit was cancelled. I took matters into my own hands in an attempt to boost my confidence and shake off the stigma of being a benefit bum. I knew I was responsible for changing my life and building a better life for my daughter. I moved to Croydon to a 2-bedroom, privately rented flat. My boyfriend at the time would turn out to be abusive, so I left there. I moved into another private rental, which was above the local housing allowance. I struggled to maintain the tenancy. The landlord's behaviour was unbelievable. I was receiving death threats. My property was entered without my consent. I was threatened with a knife on the side in my kitchen. The council wouldn't help when I went to them, and I was told the landlord needed to evict me through the proper channels. I was afraid for my life, and the lock was changed. I'd contacted the police. The police were not helpful. This was my first experience with housing criminality, and I was illegally evicted. What followed was mishap after mishap with private landlords who would abuse the fact that I was on minimal income, desperate for housing, hiking up prices, moving into properties soon to be repossessed. It was chaos. The destabilization resulted in my first child having been affected by the moving, behaviourally erupted when my son was born. I was terribly ill during my pregnancy, bedbound and unable to care well for my daughter with no support. I was in Becontree in Essex, housed temporarily by Kensington and Chelsea Council, who would then decide that I was not eligible for continued support as I had left my first flat. It was determined that it was my last affordable address, and the judge ruled that I was intentionally homeless as I'd left my first flat. It was below the local housing allowance, and that if I do not find alternative accommodation, then they had a duty to only house my children, and if that is the case, then I should place them in care immediately. My children were with me in court to hear this. My daughter's behaviour declined, and following a few months with her dad, he put her into care. Her age at the time meant that she could decide not to return home. I cannot say much else on this at the time because of child protection laws. Broken and now looking after a toddler, I knew I had to find another tenancy before the eviction date was due, and I was afraid of ending up in another private rented sector disaster. A friend loaned me some money, and it took a while before I was able to be considered by a private landlord in Chingford. This property wasn't ideal. There was heavy disrepair, mice, water leaks, serious drafts. I moved from there after 2 years. I then relocated, taking another private tenancy in Enfield, in a studio flat advertised for a single mother. The house was shared by an alcoholic, 3 other men who didn't live healthy lifestyles. The house was broken into, and there was another single mother. It was considerably run down, open brickwork, no central heating. For the first time, I contacted environmental health to where they enforced action for improvements. The landlords then, following the work being done, evicted everyone, as they were then taking back the property. I was then advised to contact Enfield Council and present the Section 21. I was advised to look for a private landlord who accepts universal credit. I found one on open rent as the days were closing in. I went to view the property, which was listed as a 1-bedroom apartment. It was in fact an illegally converted garage. A garage. I had no choice but to move into this garage, where the shutters still remained on the side of the building. I liaised with Enfield Council, who agreed to pay a first month's rent, though the asking rent was too high. The landlady reduced it to satisfy the council, though said she would only give it to me if I agreed to sign another agreement with the remaining amount. I agreed. I was desperate and glad to still live in not too far proximity from my son's school, so as not to disturb his education given previous experiences. I had to adjust a chest-high amount of rubbish piled in the front of my door in the garden. I was told it was just random things left by a previous tenant. There was a 2-week delay before it was removed, upon further alerting the landlady that rats are running riot in there, and due to the warm temperature was now starting to smell. Even though I was assured that it would be cleared before I moved in. Then the harassment started. Because I was living in a garage, I didn't have a letterbox, and I had numerous calls and messages late at night where my landlady would insist on bringing my mail to me. She lived 2 doors away, and because my address wasn't registered, my mail would go to her. She would accuse me of ignoring her if I didn't respond to her on WhatsApp or text immediately. I emailed her to state the inappropriate hours of contact. I asked for a letterbox and a clear sign that the address was my own. She declined. A week later, I returned home to find workmen on the roof. Debris on the inside of my flat and sky roofs were removed. I wasn't notified of the work to be done. Privacy was violated by workmen peering into the windows, particularly when I used the toilet. I kept on at the landlord. She ignored me. The following day, I arrived home to discover that the sky windows had been left uncovered overnight, and a chemical had been sprayed on the roof. It was so strong that it induced headaches and vomiting with myself and my son. It was so strong that it induced headaches and vomiting with myself and my son. Apologies. I would then have 2 visits to A&E as I couldn't breathe well. I later found out that I was using less than 50% of my lung capacity. I contacted environmental health. By the time anyone contacted me, the work was complete, and the inspector said that he couldn't smell anything. I was there for only 6 weeks. I moved to a shared house temporarily, which wasn't easy. I now reside in Leytonstone. The 2 weeks after I've moved in, the landlady said that she's going to take back the property as she now wants to sell. I've had to report her to my local council. I basically moved into a work site. The electricity cuts out. There's 40 appliances that don't belong to me in the property. My washing machine is currently leaking. I have mice. I don't know too much else to say at this point. I'm strong. Yeah, I don't know how much stronger I'm expected to be to have a sound and affordable space to raise my son. I implore all who are decision makers to please consider the implications of the restricted methods used to determine who can receive help. Throughout my journey, there have been landlords taking advantage of me and making money from my misery, housing me and my child in a garage, changing the locks, illegally evicting me, death threats. I've been fighting all my life to keep a roof over our heads. I wasn't always on benefits, though this has exacerbated my anxieties. I suffer with complex PTSD. Change is the only option, and I need whoever can make this happen, please make it happen. Today, right now, I can't afford to wait any longer. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lacey, for that incredibly powerful testimony. It's a brilliant, although devastating way in which to start this session, because we shouldn't need to be reminded of the personal story of people who go through what you go through, but there is nothing, I think, to replace a testimony such as the one that we've heard from you. The report that we are launching today is dealing with, and I quote in the introduction, the unregulated, exploitative, characterised by dangerously poor physical standards and insecurity of tenure. And Lacey's testimony gave us an insight into all of that. Now, I wouldn't call Lacey vulnerable. I think, in fact, you're the reverse. You are extraordinary in the strength and courage that you are showing in how you're dealing with these circumstances. But what the report shows is echoing something Julie Rugg's report also set out very clearly from 2 years ago, which is that the part of the sector that we're dealing with, the sector with criminal bad behaviour by landlords, is disproportionately impacting on vulnerable people. That is, people without the financial or other power to be able either to hold their landlords to account or to exercise choice in the market. They are people who are contracted through no fault of their own in the bottom of the private rented sector. And it is no good us just thinking in terms of, as we're often asked to do, the satisfaction ratings for the private rented sector overall, because that does not tell us anything about the needs and the characteristics of the part of the sector that we are dealing with today. We have an extraordinary panel of people who will be talking to us about the report and about the reactions to the report, which we're looking forward to over the next couple of hours, and opportunities for people hopefully to make ask questions and to make contributions. But the report is also very, very timely in lots of ways. It's timely inadvertently because it comes as we are beginning to move out of the lockdown period. And what the COVID experience has reinforced for us again is just how damaging to health, both physical and mental, poor housing is. And when people are trapped in poor housing with other adverse circumstances, that is a devastating experience, and one that has been, as we also now know without any doubt, has been affecting our poorest communities, our Black and minority ethnic communities, more than the generality. It comes precisely in the middle of a debate about the protection of tenants. We saw the eviction ban, which was due to expire last week, extended at the last minute, and with a continuing lack of clarity about the level of protection and is going to happen at the revised date in 3 weeks' time. And of course, the longer term and wider context in which we have seen the growth of the private rented sector and its increasing use for housing. People who a few years ago would have had an opportunity to enter into social housing with greater security, and at the same time, unfortunately, so since 2013 in particular, with less financial power supported by the social security system in order to protect themselves and exercise choice. And we've also seen it in the context of a decade of cuts to local government spending, which has impacted not least on the environmental health departments and other officers who we rely upon to act as proxies for some of the tenants, such as Lacey. I came into politics in a place, Hampton and North Kensington, and at a time when we were still under the shadow of a notorious class of criminal landlords like Brackman and Hoogstraten. That was visible still to me in my days as a councillor and as a member of parliament, but also the response to it were becoming dominant, which is both the greater tenant protection of the time and the growth of new social housing, particularly the wave of housing associations that grew up in response to that sector of private rent. Well, we might not have known and colour characters of the same type as that, although Fergus Wilson, amongst others, make good pitch at it. But there is no doubt, as we've heard again from today's testimony, that section of criminality still exists, and that far too many people see their lives and well-being of themselves and their families undermined by it. We need to act. We need to hear the conclusion of the report and move on them to protect tenants. So we are now going to go into our first of our speakers, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Tom Copley, the Deputy Mayor for Housing, who is going to talk about why this report is so timely, particularly for London, and how London's private tenants need to be protected. So over to you, Tom.
Just slight change. Julie Rugg is going first. But,
Julie going first?
Yes,
okay.
but Tom will be joining us later.
I chat back, and so we are going first to Julie Rugg, of course, familiar, I think, to everybody from her work on the private rented sector, report in 2018, and one of the contributors to this report. So over to you, Julie.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. In recent years, concern about experiences of people living in the private rented sector has provoked a substantial policy response in terms of increased regulation. The regulation is there, and it's dealing with landlords and letting agents who are willing to comply with the legal frameworks covering issues such as property management and property quality. However, what this report demonstrates is that this regulation is failing to deal with the landlords and the agents who have no intention of complying with the law. Now, it's very common for us to call these non-compliant landlords rogue landlords, but for many years now I've found this term singularly unhelpful, because I think it fails to represent the kinds of attitudes and behaviours that sit within a part of the market that we're talking about today. We're talking about the shadow private rented sector. I think it's more helpful to talk about criminality in the private rented sector and to start to understand the ways in which criminals operate in the market. And I don't want us to get bogged down with kind of definitions because it's very easy to get distracted by that. When we talk about criminality and criminal landlords, I want there to be a really sharp focus on individuals letting property with absolutely no intention whatsoever of operating within the legal framework. They're letting property in order to exploit what are often very vulnerable households. This is their business model. This is what they're setting out to do. We can't assume that they're operating within a moral framework. We can't assume that tweaking the regulation is going to bring these landlords to heel. For the most part, the kind of criminal behaviours that this research addresses falls under three really broad categories, and I'm just going to quickly talk about these this morning. And these categories do intersect with each other, so they're not kind of separated out. First, I think that it's clear that some of the criminals that are evident in this particular report are seeking to profit from fraud within the lettings context. And there are many, many types of fraudulent activity. And I think Ben will probably talk us through some more of this later. But the two things that I think are particularly marked are defrauding prospective tenants through false lettings on the internet. And so online lettings on the internet, tenants turn up, they've seen photographs of the property, but they by no means match what they're being offered. They refuse to take the property and the landlord keeps the deposit either way. So these are kind of like scams really that operate often through the internet. Rather more complex kinds of fraudulent activity are kind of rent-to-rent scams where a criminal might take a property from a legitimate landlord or letting agent, illegally subdivide the property without the landlord or agent's knowledge, and then sublet all of those rooms to people who've got no understanding that the person that they're paying rent to isn't the landlord, isn't the letting agent. It's just been subdivided without permission. And really, it's only when the landlord or agent, the legitimate landlord or agent, realises that they're not receiving any rent that the whole sort of scheme comes to light. Now, one of the things about this kind of fraudulent activity, and it was very surprising to me, is the degree to which letting agents were involved in that kind of action. I'd kind of, I suppose, a little naively presumed that letting agent involvement might police the sector, but in actuality, letting agents were often involved in the kind of fraudulent activity that comes out in this research that we've looked at today. This kind of activity, we can understand this as fraud, but it's very difficult to investigate. These online companies, they set up, they disappear, they phoenix really kind of fairly instantaneously once people sort of track down that something's going on. Tenants might just be paying in cash. The landlord might be disingenuous about their identity. The tenant might only have a name and a number as in terms of who's actually perpetrating the fraud. So it's very difficult for local authorities and trading standards people to effectively investigate those kinds of fraudulent activity. A second type of criminal activity, I think, are individuals who let property with absolutely no concern whatsoever for the health and safety of tenants. And Lacey's talked to us about her experience, and it was very clear there that the person that she was dealing with, who was subletting the garage, had simply no concern at all whatsoever for Lacey's safety and the safety of her child. So these are criminals often who are seeking to gather a rental income from poorly converted properties, from properties subdivided into rooms barely bigger than the bed, with egregious levels of overcrowding, where we'd see multiple households sharing inadequate kitchen and bathroom facilities. There may be linkages to sex and labour trafficking, and clearly economic migrants and individuals without recourse to public funds are vulnerable to this kind of exploitation. And these are properties where there's been absolutely no attempt whatsoever to consider fitness for human habitation. We might consider this kind of letting under the heading of criminal negligence. There is a reckless disregard of legal duty and of possible harm to another party. And I think in some, we have to sort of acknowledge that this is difference in degree and intent from a landlord simply not attending to their maintenance responsibility. I accept that the consequences may be the same for the tenant, but I think our policy response should be different. It's important to distinguish criminals who set out to reap a reward through offering barely adequate housing and have decided actively to exploit individuals who are in no position to refuse that housing. A third kind of group, which Lacey also has unfortunately had experience of it, are individuals who continue to exploit their tenants, who hold their tenants in thrall by the use of threatened violence. This is a very, very serious matter indeed. And I don't think it's unreasonable to really kind of think our way through this experience by drawing an analogy with domestic violence, because the threat is felt in the domestic setting, in the place where the victim might expect to feel safe. You'll see through reading through the case studies that we've produced in the report, the tenants there were experiencing low-level, unpredictable, threatening behaviours, including landlords turning up at their properties without due notice. And I can't imagine how terrifying it is to know that the person that you're most afraid of has the key to your front door. Illegal eviction was commonplace amongst the case studies in the report, and this is one of the behaviours that very clearly is classified as criminal, but where we found the statutory response was really the poorest. It shouldn't be possible that there can be no police support for an individual who comes home from work to find that the landlord's glued up the lock and thrown their possessions into the street. Losing a home in this way visits such a high degree of trauma on the victim. I think it's personal assault. It's simply shouldn't be supportable. So this report makes a series of recommendations, and I just want to kind of highlight 5. I think at the very least we need online lettings platforms to take some culpability for the illegal practices that flourish on their websites. At the very least they should be offering some pointers to educate site users to be alert to signals that a letting might be a scam. We need the government to place a duty on the police to enforce the provisions of the Protection from Eviction Act. This isn't something that should really be passed on to local authorities. It's almost a cliche now, and I've heard this so often in undertaking this work, that the police are more likely to turn up to support a landlord who's illegally evicting a tenant than they are to turn up to support a tenant who's being illegally evicted. We need the police confidently to pursue housing-related offences, and we need criminals to know that where an illegal eviction comes to the notice of authorities, then it's likely the case will be investigated. And this leads to a kind of connected ask, that the government creates a fund to support local authorities to recruit expertise and so increased their capacity to pursue civil remedies under the Housing and Planning Act. The Housing and Planning Act brings an awful lot of new powers to local authorities, and some of them are getting very, very good at exercising those powers, but performance is patchy. I think we need to invest in sector enforcement. The expansion of the private rented sector has come at a time when local authorities are becoming increasingly de-skilled. This is something that Karen's mentioned. Austerity measures have led to a collapse in demand for enforcement skills, and we really need to rebuild the labour market, rebuild confidence that an individual training to be enforcement officer will find work in that area. We also need local authorities to introduce more effective joint working when they seek to use the PRS to meet homelessness functions. It's shocking, we've heard from Lacey, that local authorities were involved in her placement with a criminal landlord who was in fact paid an incentive by the local authority to house her in a poorly converted garage. Homelessness teams are best placed to collect data on the criminals who exploit vulnerable households in the housing market, but homelessness teams don't work closely enough with enforcement teams. I think something's clearly going wrong when placing homeless households in the PRS means we sometimes rely on and even reward criminals in the lettings market. And finally, I think we need a system for the collection of data on the incidence of illegal eviction. We can't say how prevalent this crime is at the minute. And indeed, since we started work on this report, this is a question that's been asked of us time and time again. How big a problem is it? You know, journalists ask us, civil servants ask us. In some ways, it's a signal that unless we can count it, it doesn't matter. And I think we really need to sort of change the way in which we view this particular crime. We need to collect the data so that the crime no longer evades scrutiny. We need to understand where it happens, the circumstances in which it happens, and we need to start monitoring where counter-effective measures against illegal eviction where they've been effective. Finally, I want to say policing isn't just done by the police. Austerity measures have undermined effective sector scrutiny across the board by environmental health professionals, trading standards, homelessness officers, and tenancy relations officers. Really important tenancy relations officers. Clearly, the Renters Reform Bill is a good opportunity to investigate these issues, but only if new measures also identify and bolster the resources needed to investigate not just non-compliance, but also active criminality and secure effective punishment for that criminality. Thank you.
Thank you much, Judith. That was a brilliant summary of the report, and we're very grateful for the discussion. So now our next speaker is Will Tanner. Will is a director of UK Forward, which is a campaigning charity committed to making Britain a fairer society, and formerly worked for Theresa May. So we're looking forward to hearing from you, Will.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Karen, and thank you for having me here today. It was incredibly kind of timely to hear from Lacey about her own experiences, and I just wanted to kind of start by paying tribute to her for kind of having the courage to talk about those experiences and what sounds like incredibly kind of difficult and harrowing circumstances that really does bring to life many of the issues that your report gets into. And I kind of wanted to start with that really by saying just very clearly that the issue you raise here is an incredibly serious one, criminal landlordism, and I think the phrase criminal landlords is a good one, clearly makes the lives of some of society's most vulnerable people miserable, and also enriches the wallets of some of society's most unscrupulous people. So it's clearly something that we should act upon, and it clearly has no place in a civilized industrialized country such as ours. But it's also important to recognise that this problem has existed since time immemorial, especially when we're talking about our capital, London. When I was reading your report, I was kind of thrown back to kind of childhood reading lists of Charles Dickens or George Orwell, or the more recent book, This Is London, by Ben Judah, which chronicles the exploitation of London's kind of poor, vulnerable and isolated communities, especially immigrant communities, including by slum landlords. And so I'm kind of struck by the fact that some of these problems have been going on for a very long time, and things that we have previously tried to do to kind of stamp out this type of criminal activity, this type of kind of exploitation, have not worked. And I think one of the reasons for that, which the report goes into a great amount of detail on, is because this type of activity targets precisely those people who are hidden from view in society. They are less visible to politicians, to the public, to the media, and who typically are less able to use normal channels of redress, and less equipped to fight for their own rights because of lack of funds, lack of English language, lack of knowledge that perhaps exists in other communities. And also, frankly, because they are less visible to the authorities for those reasons too, and therefore the authorities are less willing to take action. And it's also something that governments of all stripes and colours have tried to tackle over many years as well. I mean, the previous Labour government attempted action in this space. The David Cameron's government talked repeatedly about rogue landlords, but as this report suggests, we've only had some limited success. So the first point I wanted to make is relatively depressing, but the kind of next point, I suppose, is more positive, which is that I'm increasingly hopeful that there's a kind of growing cross-party consensus on the need to tackle abuse within the private rented sector more generally. And I say that because 3 years ago, when I was in government working for Theresa May, we were very keen to take action in the private rented sector. Indeed, it was one of the many kind of burning injustices that Theresa was most passionate about fixing. And we encountered quite a lot of resistance repeatedly, not because people didn't recognise that it was an issue, but because the issue was problematic in a number of different ways. I think many people will recognise that the Conservative Party instinctively does not like regulation. It sees it as potentially creating more harm than good. There is potentially a resistance to tackling the kind of private rented sector because a large number of Tory MPs and voters are landlords, and many of those landlords, as Julie says, are well-meaning, well-intentioned and well-behaved. So the possibility of unintentionally targeting kind of good actors is there, and there is always a risk. And for a number of other reasons too. I mean, the private rented sector has been seen as a kind of political success for the Conservative Party over many years, a way of building more homes to ensure that more people have the opportunity of good quality housing. So in some ways, 3 years ago, I was quite dispirited about the prospect of renters reform, but we nevertheless attempted to bring in reforms, and actually Theresa originally introduced the consultation that has led to the renters reform bill, which this government has committed to. And I think actually over the course of the last 3 years, following the 2017 general election, and in particular the 2019 general election, the changing electoral coalition of the Conservative Party means that there is just much greater support and a much greater recognition of these issues. These issues just frankly matter a lot more to Conservative voters than they have done potentially previously. And so I think it was very notable that the Conservative manifesto talked about a promise that if you are a tenant, you will be protected from revenge evictions and rogue landlords, and made commitments to end Section 21, to introduce specialised housing courts and create a secure process for eviction, and to professionalise the letting industry, quotes, for the benefit of tenants and landlords, although we don't yet know exactly what that means. So I think there has been a welcome shift in Conservative Party policy towards the private rented sector. I would also point to quite an important shift, I think, that is happening on the left and in the Labour Party, which is moving towards the Conservative position too, where it feels like, whereas 3 years ago, and Karen and others may correct me here, but 3 years ago it felt like the Labour Party was it kind of had a tendency to focus on what I would call kind of very hard, quite restrictive regulatory measures, such as rent caps and potentially quite onerous mandatory licensing regimes. It feels like the Labour Party is potentially moving towards a place where it's willing to work with the government quite closely on the renters reform bill, and recognises the government's intent. So that gives me some hope that this government and working with the Labour Party can make some real progress in terms of modernising and professionalising the rented sector and stamping out lots of this abuse. So I think there are conditions for reform. But I just wanted to kind of alight upon the recommendations in Julie's report, and to kind of just raise one note of caution, really, which is that I think the report makes a lot of very sensible recommendations, exactly the type of recommendations that should work, that should make a difference: getting the police to take their responsibilities more seriously, equipping local authorities with the power and resources to enforce action, asking the tech platforms to do more. All of these are very sensible ideas in principle. But I just have a sense of caution about whether or not they'll be effective on the basis of other kind of experience. So in my 3 years kind of overseeing police reform in the Home Office, I did not conclude that placing a duty on police officers was an effective way of making them do something. That's not because they don't want to do it, or because they don't listen to the law. It's because they have a huge amount of competing demands, and frankly there will be other activity which is deemed a priority by their police and crime commissioner, by their chief constable, and this type of activity, kind of standards enforcement, as it were, is typically not regarded as that high up the list. And I don't think any amount of duties will necessarily change that in and of themselves. Similarly, the experience with trying to ask Facebook or YouTube or Twitter to remove terrorist-related content from their platforms, so literally content telling people to kind of commit mass murder, proves how difficult it is to drive real behavioural change and to stamp out negative content on some of those online platforms. It is frankly much harder than it should be. And finally, we all know, as has been repeatedly referenced already in this event, how under-resourced local authorities are. And so giving local authorities more resource is not to say it's necessarily a bad thing, but whether or not that resource will be directed towards this type of enforcement, I have some queries about. So to my mind, it feels like some of the cross-party consensus could be, I think it could lead to some really genuine change, but if it is going to lead to really effective change, it should look at the incentives in the institutions which actually drive behaviour within the market itself rather than just within the enforcement context. And I've been a long supporter of some proposals that Julie Rugg has made previously about effectively trying to treat the housing market, the private rented sector, much more like the kind of vehicles market, or the regulation which exists for private vehicles, where houses would have a regular property MOT if they were rented out, and that there would be some kind of property identification number for every rented property, and potentially every property full stop, in order to ensure that, for example, if Open Rent or Airbnb was advertising a property, then it could list the registered number and list the MOT, and to drive kind of behavioural change through market enforcement rather than through kind of government enforcement. And I don't say that because I think your recommendations are wrong, or indeed kind of directed in the wrong direction. I think they're kind of the right recommendations in principle, but I just have questions about whether or not they would work in practice. So I hope that that's a kind of quick overview of the politics and some of the practicalities. This is hard, and there's a reason that these problems have existed for many years. But hopefully, in the next few years, we will have a coalition of the willing to actually make a difference.
Thank you very much for that. It's very great to have your perspective, and I'm sure that will stimulate quite a lot of contributions as well. So it's a really important angle that you've come from. So I'm now going to invite Ben Reeve-Lewis to speak to us. Ben is a founding member of Cambridge House, who have been one of the driving forces in this report, and has also as an educator in the enforcement field. So he will be taking us through some of the specific content of the report. So looking forward to hearing from you, Ben.
All right, thanks, Karen. I've done a PowerPoint, so I'm going to talk you through this. Hold on a second. Yes, right. The criminal landlord. Some of the points, I suppose, have been covered. Julie mentioned some of the things, but I want to talk about the evolution. I'm going to be talking in these 15 minutes about three things, really, about the evolution, about one of the biggest problems that you get in housing enforcement, which is called rent-to-rent scamming, and also some of the other recommendations that we've got. Julie mentioned recommendations that come from the report, but we've got a number of other recommendations that we're going to be promoting as campaigns over the coming year. So that's where I'm going here. Picture there on the slide is Peter Rackman, for those of you who don't know him. He was the one who kind of coined, well, he didn't coin the phrase. The phrase Rackmanism comes from him. He was a slum landlord in the late 50s and early 60s. Who was behaviour was off the scale. And I'm going to be talking at first about the evolution of landlords and what's changed, particularly in the last 10 years. People talk about the Protection from Eviction Act, but harassment and illegal eviction was actually first criminalised in 1965 in the Rent Act there when it first came in, and things have rolled on pretty much from that way. As Will said, there's always been Rackmans operating in the PRS, but what is notable, particularly about the last 10 years, is the nature and how the quality of them has actually changed. I mean, I started as a tenancy relations officer in 1990, 30 years ago, which is quite astonishing to me. And I've said people quite regularly, back then, your average rogue landlord was a fella called Ron, Big Ron usually, from the Old Kent Road, who had a bit of an attitude to him. He had the same kind of harassment, illegal eviction going on, but the difference was at that time you knew who he was, you knew his real name. You knew where he lived, and you knew the properties that have come in. But in the last 10 to 15 years, that's changed quite dramatically now. The perfect storm has come together with the housing crisis, the rise of rents, particularly in London, the increase in the size of the private rented sector. And like any area where it's seen that you can actually make easy money, it's got to attract criminals. The same way that I read that the mafia are moving into adulterating olive oil because of the growth in the market of foodies who want to buy nice olive oil. So wherever there's money, they will move to. They wouldn't necessarily be landlords or letting agents other than that. And also the internet hasn't helped either with its ability to advertise. We see a lot of fraud perpetrated through online property portals, and also people generally being able to hide their identity in that way. And that makes it difficult for housing enforcement officers trying to track these people down. In a way, as I say, 30 years ago, we knew who Big Ron was and we knew where he lived. But now, more often than not, you're dealing with aliases and property fraud. And the problem for a lot of housing enforcement is you have to be fraud investigators on top of housing enforcement people as well. We've also seen a huge rise, an explosion even, I would say, in criminal letting agents getting into the business. A hell of a lot more than they ever used to be before. About 18 months ago, I attended a conference, London Trading Standards, on the lettings agency industry. And the head of one London borough said that they'd done a head count of letting agents in their area in 2014, and there was 48. And they did the same head count in 2017, and there was 286. And that doesn't account for the people who are using online property portals, advertising abroad to people in foreign countries where they're using their own language to come to London and rent properties that are usually in illegal, unauthorised, overcrowded slums, really. It's not stopped the illegal evictions. We're seeing an increase in them. Safer Renting's database shows that in the last 14 months, we've dealt with 152 illegal evictions, 2 in the last few days. And in many instances, because of the aliases and the change of fake companies, it's difficult to find out even who these people are. This is the different thing when you get people renting with criminal intent. Housing enforcement sites, we've been given, as Will said, we've had lots of tools gifted to us over the last few years. We've got banning orders, interim management orders, rent repayment orders, civil penalty notices. But the problem is, as again, Will said, there is staff and resources to enforce them. There's a very interesting report that came out in 2017 that Stephen Battersby did with Karen as well, Karen Buck, who's hosting this event, that looked at the staffing levels in housing enforcement among environmental health and the private rented sector. But the data around at that time, the size of the POS was taken from the census of 2012, which was woefully short of what it is now, even in 2017. And the last figures they had on staffing levels in 2015. And the way that worked out is that it seems likely that in London there are only 2.4 environmental health officers for every 10,000 privately rented properties, which is just absolutely astonishing. Trading standards have a role in policing the private rented sector, but there's even less of them than there are housing enforcement officers. And as Julie said, many local authorities have got rid of their tenancy relations officers. TROs are the people who deal with harassment and illegal eviction and support and advocate for tenants in that bottom end of the sector. So these figures are going to be even bigger now, but it's difficult, again, as Julie said, people aren't counting them. Now, one of the big scams we get that everyone in housing enforcement recognises now, particularly in London, is called rent-to-rent scamming, which is essentially where someone gives a property to an agent lends it to a tenant, and the tenant gets loads of other people in it. And you can, if you rent-to-rent scam it, where you're putting up stud walling and putting 12 or 15 people in a 3-bedroom house, you can double your rental income. We went out with Waltham Forest on Tuesday, the week before last, to a converted garage, and that was attached to a house. And we interviewed all the tenants in and found that the landlord there was receiving £5,300 a month in rental income. And these things are being promoted all over the place. That page there is, I believe, a woman called Vicky from Ipswich who runs an online events thing on how to increase your rental yield by getting into rent-to-rent. Now, nothing illegal about rent-to-rent. That's been going on for years. But rent-to-rent scamming is where everyone... Well, I've got to give you an idea of how rent-to-rent scamming works in a minute in reality. But it's a big business now. People have whole conferences in hotels about using rent-to-rent to increase your money. So to illustrate this point and to give you a notion of a typical journey in the shadow private rented sector, I'm going to introduce you to our hypothetical Tanya. She's in the gig economy, 0 hours, £7 an hour, below minimum wage, and she just does cleaning. She's a typical kind of resident in the private rented sector down the shadow end. She isn't on benefits. Landlords don't take people on benefits generally in that bottom end. Years ago, used to be the most exploited tenants were those on benefits, but the criminal landlords and the criminal agents today realise that if they give tenancy agreements and receipts for rent to anyone who's on benefits, it's likely to lead to discovery of their HMOs, their unlicensed HMOs. And typically Tanya's very low money. She can only afford about £400 a month. In this case, her friend lent her £1,000 to rent a room in a house, usually probably with about 10, 12, 15 people in it. Some of them are sharing, some of them aren't. Now, when she signs up, she goes into an agency or she goes online, and the structure looks like this. She gets her agent, she gets her property, she moves in, she's glad she's procured property for herself so she can live. What she finds when she's in there is that that agent was only authorised to sign her up. And then she actually pays her money to another agent with a different name. So she makes way she's dealing with 2 different people. Then as time goes on, she'll find on that there's a different agent for repairs. Now, these 3 agents might be the same people, different departments, or they could be 3 completely unrelated companies. Some will be limited and some wouldn't. And then she finds that there might be a property management group above the whole thing. And then above that, you've got the landlord. So straight away, in her £400 room, Tanya is at the bottom of this massive pyramid. Now, the local authority enforcement discover that it's unlicensed, overcrowded, there's no fire safety, and they contact the relevant people. The minute they contact the relevant people, this happens. Everyone starts blaming everyone else. And they start saying, I thought she'd gone. She's a squatter. I didn't give them permission to sublet. She's a drug dealer. She's got no written contract. All these things start falling down on poor Tanya's head with only a little room of £400 if she isn't even sharing. Now, that's enough at stage 1 when the local authority find out about it. What happens after that is that local authority threaten action. And then that whole pyramid just toppled down on Tanya's head. Everyone starts to blame her. She gets illegally evicted. She loses her deposit that wasn't protected anyway. She has her passport stolen. She has all her other belongings stolen as well. And that's all for this one woman trying to keep a roof over her head in a £400 a month room because of the promotion of rent-to-rent scam. And the sad thing is, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to lie to you. I've been lying to you that Tanya is not a hypothetical person. I just changed her name. She's a real person. And we took her on last month, I think it was, maybe 6 weeks ago. And when the landlord kicked her out, he stole all her belongings. And he also stole the bunches of keys she uses for her work as a cleaner. And her employment agency is saying they're now going to deduct £1,000 a month from her wages in order to pay back, even though it was nothing to do with her. That's a story like Lacey's story, a typical journey in the shadow private rented sector. When we started this report, it was called a journey through the shadow private rented sector. But the more people we interviewed, the more we realised that people don't get out of it. They get stuck in there if they've got no money and no choices. So we're going to propose to do something about that. And these are going to be 4 of our campaign things. There's more of them. There's about 13 of them. But I just wanted to introduce you to 4 to give you the flavour of what we're going to be promoting over the next 12 months. We've looked at what we call them asks, and we've taken the view that we're not looking for big changes in law, but little tweaks that can actually be achievable. We're not so naive as to think you can rewrite a whole piece of legislation overnight, but you can add things. And we've seen other areas where adding parts to that legislation has actually worked. One of them is to amend the Land Compensation Act of 1973. If a property gets so bad in condition, if it deteriorates so bad that the local authority are forced to close it down under a prohibition order, which they put off doing, they try not to. They try and work with the landlords on that. But if they do it, the Land Compensation Act places a housing duty on the local authority, and also that makes the local authority pay a home loss payment to the displaced tenants. It starts around £6,400. It goes upwards from there. So our simple change, our ask is where you've got a landlord or an agent that's let a property deteriorate to such an extent that it has to be shut down, why should the public purse be compensating the tenants? it should be the landlord, the property owner, who has to pay that money. That just to me seems to be basic ethics, really, and common sense. Another recommendation of the 4 we've got is to make perpetrators of eviction responsible for all costs of homelessness functions, because it isn't always easy to get people back in. Sometimes people are terrified of their landlord. They've been evicted with violence, and sometimes various technical reasons it's just not possible to do it. So in many of those cases, not all, some of them just don't get recorded, they go anywhere, but many of those people end up in the homelessness unit, and that costs money again. So we want to propose to create a normal, formal route for when a local authority have been forced to come in to rescue a situation where someone has illegally evicted them, that damages should be sought against the perpetrator for any and all costs of the housing, temporary accommodation, officer time. Even if it's decided that someone's in temporary accommodation and they're not in priority need, and that gets challenged by way of judicial review, that's still work of the homelessness unit, and it still be charged on the perpetrator of the illegal eviction. Number 3, interim management orders. Now, interim IMOs are a facility that allows the local authority to take over control of a property for 12 months and receive the rent for that property and generally do the repairs and everything anyone would do. That's only where the landlord hasn't got a license, there's no feasible chance they're going to get one. And we're simply proposing to extend the use of IMOs to include cases where the landlord is so incapable of managing their properties that they're guilty of harassment and illegal eviction, and allow the council to take over control of that property. That's already happened under Housing and Planning Act 2016. They added harassment and illegal eviction to the things that a rent repayment order can be claimed for. So we're just proposing exactly the same thing. I know some local authorities would balk at this because they fear that they don't have the facilities to manage properties, but there's no reason why you can't punt this work out to a local letting agent. London Borough of Waltham Forest have got an in-house 8 IMO management team who do great work, really, really good work, and they're quite open to taking contracts from other people as well. And the 4th and final recommendation that we're going to be campaigning for coming in next year, and this is, again, Julie has mentioned this, about illegal eviction being the ultimate theft. Not only do people lose their home, but they also quite commonly steal people's possessions as well to reduce evidence of occupation. But on top of that, they steal people's sense of security and well-being. The forced removes and the fear that they live under means children's educational development and personal confidence gets hampered, and people's mental health suffered. Now, harassment and illegal eviction under the Protection from Eviction Act carries a potentially unlimited fine and a chance of 2 years in prison. And yet shoplifting more than £200 worth of goods carries a 7-year prison sentence, and illegally downloading films and music carries a 10-year sentence, indicating that society treats the theft of someone's home, illegal eviction, as less serious than a single mum nicking from Marks and Spencer's. So there's that thing to address at the time. Now, I can live with an unlimited prison sentence and 2 years in prison for illegal eviction, even aside for how you look at how importantly it's regarded. If the judiciary were to actually impose those sanctions, generally magistrates will award well below £1,000, and often people will just get community service or a curfew. There was a case I read last year of a landlord in Peterborough, I think it was, who illegally evicted his tenant, who ended up sleeping in the garden because he couldn't get into his home, and was hospitalised with hypothermia. And he was prosecuted, and the magistrates gave the landlord a conditional discharge against 2 years in prison or an unlimited fine. And what we want to see is sentencing guidelines changed so that they will impose a prison sentence as a matter of routine and start levying unlimited fines, not the way that it actually works. And these things, if you put them all together with our proposals to extend interim management orders for PFEA breaches and the existing powers of tenants to claim money back for rent repayment orders, would present a really serious deterrent and showed criminal landlords that it's not necessarily easy money. And to recap, it's really important to understand that the rogue landlord of 1990 is not the same as the rogue landlord of 2020. They're not even the same as the rogue landlord of 2011, when the term was first coined by Shelter. It's systematic criminal activity. Harassment and illegal eviction are common daily occurrences. We picked one up yesterday. We picked up another one on Friday. And if you read the article in the Observer from the weekend before last about those lads living in a garage and the people in the house, they said they feared being illegally evicted. Well, that happened on Friday. So we're kind of dealing with that. It's everywhere. It ruins people's lives. It ruins people's futures. And I heartily do not believe the common thing that's thrown back to dismiss this problem, that these are the actions of a few rotten apples. It's not. It's changed completely. The people who are doing this are systematic. They're using organised criminal activity to defraud people on every basis. That's the difference between the rogue landlord of 1990 and the rogue landlord of 2020. This has got to stop. And I'm hoping, thanks for your time, that as the year goes on, you'll support our recommendations and that will aim to plug the loop that exploits criminals and protects renters. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. That was absolutely fantastic summary of the key points out of the report. Can I just take this to encourage people to help us spread the message of the content of this report by live tweeting as you're take part in this discussion. We've got a couple of hashtags that we're encouraging everyone to use, which is hashtag renting from criminals and hashtag journey in the shadows PRS. So please do join in. Cambridge House, Trust for London and others have got the links to the report, but please do help us to get debate percolating out more widely. Anyway, so we're now moving on to Tom Copley. We're delighted to be joined by Tom, the Deputy Mayor Housing, who's been very active in this field for a long time, and one of the most recent areas in which he's dipped into some of this, been around the appalling additions in some of the community development schemes that we've seen, and other whole subsection of this area of policy. And Tom is going to talk to us about why this is a particularly relevant area for Londoners. So Tom, over to you.
Thanks very much, Karen, and apologies for being late. I was actually out on a site visit this morning, which I think is the first one I've been on since March, and it felt like a very novel experience. But I was really pleased to be able to catch most of Ben's presentation just then. I'm looking forward to the discussion and the rest of the session. And Karen mentioned permitted development rights. I shall try not to go off on a tangent about those, but that's something that certainly at City Hall we're incredibly worried about, and the potential for that to deliver a whole new generation of slum housing in London, particularly as demand for office space decreases. But turning to this report and turning to the private rented sector. It's worth highlighting, first of all, and I went a couple of weeks ago to visit some tenants at Somerford Grove in Hackney who were being evicted by not even their landlord, by their managing agent. It was one of those absent landlords who is hidden behind a managing agent. And this is a landlord that owns a huge amount of property, very, very wealthy. And they were being evicted, not because they hadn't paid their rent, they paid their rent, but because they'd been organising tenants and trying to secure a rent reduction because of the implications of COVID-19. And this was a classic case of revenge eviction. Now, this wasn't the shadow private rented sector, this was the mainstream private rented sector, but it just serves to highlight the power imbalance between landlords and tenants throughout the private rented sector, and the need for wide-ranging reforms. And I really welcome this report, and I'm pleased to say that the recommendations in it align very much with things that the Mayor Sadiq Khan has been calling for, and which I will touch on a little bit further over the next few minutes. And one of the reasons, I mean, the key reasons why this report is so important for London is, of course, the sheer size of the private rented sector in London. It's bigger than any other private rented sector in any other city or part of the UK. You've got now well over a quarter, soon to be a third of Londoners renting from private landlords. That's 2.6 million people, including now over 500,000 children, which of course, going back sort of even sort of 15 or 20 years, it was quite rare for families with children to be living in the private rented sector. Now it's very, 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 very common, despite the fact that the sector remains incredibly insecure. And while a great many landlords, of course, provide a very good service, it's clear that too many renters live in insecure or substandard properties where they may face the constant threat of eviction, including revenge eviction, which might make them afraid to make complaints about the condition of their property, and indeed those who suffer at the hands of criminal landlords and lettings agents, as has been highlighted in this report, which really shines a light on the plight faced by those renting in what you might call the more informal parts of London's rental market, many of whom are already vulnerable or disadvantaged, perhaps as a result, for example, of the government's hostile environment policies. And it just adds to the growing weight of evidence that we need wholesale reform of our private rented sector. The entire regulatory system is piecemeal, outdated, and of course under-resourced. And local authorities who are expected to carry out enforcement in the private rented sector and enforcement of standards have of course just faced a decade of austerity, which has cut back their budget, and now of course face even further pressures on their finances due to COVID-19. And COVID-19 has highlighted the precariousness and thrown into stark relief the housing inequalities we all knew were already there, particularly for the most vulnerable groups, for those, for example, who are living in overcrowded accommodation, and of course those living in the private rented sector, which is incredibly precarious. And there's no doubt that the ongoing consequences of the pandemic are going to make it more difficult for Londoners to pay their rents, and has already led to an increase in reports of harassment by landlords and indeed of illegal evictions. So Sadiq Khan is committed to improving standards and conditions in the private rented sector, although it should be noted that he actually has no formal powers over the private rented sector at all. And I think this is something that a lot of people find quite shocking and surprising. It's certainly in contrast to the mayors of many other major cities around the world, notably cities like Berlin, where the city government actually has a lot of say and a lot of control over private renting. We don't have any of that in London at all. Nonetheless, the mayor has been taking action and has been lobbying the government to take action on reform of private renting. He's published his blueprint for renting in London last July, which sets out his vision for how the private rented sector in London needs to be reformed. And this, of course, includes scrapping Section 21 no-fault evictions, which is something that is called for by the Safer Renting report. Unfortunately, which the government have now committed to do as part of their renters reform bill. Although I have to say it's very disappointing the government didn't use the time during COVID, during the ban on evictions, a temporary ban on evictions, to actually get on and sort out the abolition of no-fault eviction for the longer term. And we at City Hall, we continue to engage with MHCLG and the government to try and make sure that the bill is going to crucially include the resources that local authorities need to enforce against rogue landlords and rogue operators. And the mayor's also been working to try and build partnerships in and between local authorities, which again is something that it's very welcome to see is called for in this report. And the private rented sector partnership, the Mayor's Private Rented Sector Partnership has brought together borough environmental health and trading standard teams to share best practice and to discuss joint approaches to improving standards in the private rented sector. And the Mayor's also been setting up a number of tools to help Londoners to find rogue landlords and to take them on. So the Mayor's Rogue Landlord and Agent Checker and report a Rogue tools have been developed in conjunction with the Private Rented Sector Partnership, and these are empowering renters in London to check landlords and lettings agents for housing related prosecutions and to report rogue activity or poor standards. And so far 2,300 offences have been uploaded to the system, which has been viewed over 210,000 times. Sadiq has also introduced the Better Renting Project to create additional capacity in borough private rented sector teams to enforce action against malpractice in the sector, including through the delivery of a new qualification for private rented sector practitioners. And as part of this, we recently launched training which has trained over 1,000 Met Police officers in terms of how to deal with illegal evictions. Which is something that I know that Safer Renting has been calling for and is being delivered in partnership with Safer Renting. And we've been delivering training to upskill borough private rented sector staff on key topics, including essential landlord and tenant law, which is particularly crucial during the COVID-19 crisis when, as I say, we've been seeing an increase in attempts at illegal evictions. And we're also recognising the particular challenges experienced by boroughs in identifying unlicensed houses in multiple occupation, as is also identified in the report. And we're working with the private rented sector practice to put in place a tool that will enable renters to check whether their property needs a licence, and if they suspect their property is unlicensed, to report this to their local council to investigate. So that's just a bit of a summary of some of the things that have been introduced by the Mayor from City Hall. But just to reiterate the point, and the point that is being made in the Safer Renting report, we need action from the government on this. We need action from the government to reform private renting, to reform private tenancies, to give tenants security, in particular where tenants are renting for much longer. And where more and more children are living in the private rented sector who desperately need security, so they're not being forced to move around and move out of local schools and all the disruption that entails. We need this security. We need more affordability, and crucially as well, because this can't be forgotten, it's no good just loading more responsibilities onto local councils. It's important that local councils do have powers, but it's even more important that they have the resources to enforce those powers, and we need the government to give them that as well. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I'm looking forward to the rest of this discussion, and thank you for publishing this really important report.
Thank you very much for that, Tom, indeed. And as you say, I think people don't properly understand how it is that that senior politicians like our mayors don't have the kind of power that would help us to act in defence of tenants, particularly given the numbers there are in Manchester, in London, and other cities. That's something that we have to continue to press on. So there is chat going on, questions being asked, which is absolutely fantastic. And I'm going to look at those as we move into the panel session now, where we're going to have a Q&A, a short introduction from our panel speakers, and then I'll pick some of the questions from the chat and get that into a bit of a to and fro with the audience. So we are now going to hear from a panel which will begin with Ros Spencer, who of course is one of the authors of the report and one of the key champions of developing a response to protect tenants from criminal landlords. James Murray, a former deputy mayor, also housing in London, and now of course the MP for Ealing North. David Beach, who's the Director of Enforcement at Waltham Forest Council, Caitlin Wilkinson from Generation Rent, and Chris Norris, the Director of Policy and Practice at the NRLA. It's very welcome to have the landlords here as part of this discussion. So a short intro from each of you, our five panelists, and then we'll be picking up some questions and allowing you to respond to them. So can I ask Ros to kick us off, please?
Right. I'm so pleased to have the contributions from this wide range of contributors to something which has been something we've been giving birth to for the better part of 4 years, and in much greater detail in the last 2 years. In many ways, we feel so close to it. It's very difficult to get a perspective on what are the key priorities, because there are so many. And I'd just like to say that there are many recommendations. I think it's 11 in total in our published report. That's very far from being the extent of what we'd recommend. We've tried to really focus on the things that are easiest and most cost efficient to do, but the many other things around resourcing and big change to the regulatory framework. There are many things that are already out there and on the table, which government are considering perhaps, but haven't yet come through, which we support as well. So I'm happy to just pass on to the rest of the panel and hope that we'll get an opportunity to address some of those big issues in the debate. Who was next?
Okay, next is James Murray.
Thanks very much, Karen, and thanks for having me along today. I think that, you know, for me, I've been an MP since December 2019, and as I've grown used to telling people, I spent much more of that in lockdown than I have out of lockdown. So most of my experience is very much in the context of COVID-19. And I think with things right across the board, whether that's employment rights, whether that's housing, whether that's health inequalities and so on, COVID has exacerbated and really exposed for everyone to see the inequalities that many of which we already faced and many people on this call already know existed. And I think that's particularly true of the private rented sector, where people who are living in private renting accommodation have needed help to make sure they're protected from eviction during the COVID outbreak. And where people quite often don't have a spare room at home or necessarily access to decent outside space to make working from home and some of the isolation and quarantining more tolerable than it has been for people who have access to bigger homes. So I think a lot of the housing inequality has really come to the fore through the COVID crisis. I think that although the COVID crisis has really drawn wide attention to the inequalities that exist, for me, as an MP and with Karen and other colleagues in Parliament, it's really important that government don't see the response to the inequalities exposed by COVID as something to which there can be a quick fix, just to fix the issues specifically around COVID. This is actually a chance for us to build back better, as the phrase goes, after the COVID crisis, and actually to use this opportunity to push the government on commitments they have already made about reforming the private rented sector, scrapping Section 21, and so on. Now, there's going to be a lot of detail to go through in Parliament for me and other MPs when the government does come forward with any proposals to reform the private rented sector. But I think what the COVID crisis has brought to my attention is the fact that whilst we all on this call, I'm sure, know the challenges that private renters face, I think that inequality has been brought to the attention of the wider public through what's happened in recent months. And we need to make sure that in the future, that in the coming months and years, we do improve a lot of private renters so that both after the outbreak and should any outbreak measures come back in future, they'll be in a better position. So I think this is very timely. It's an issue which has been going on for all of us on this call will know for many, many years. But now with the government having made a commitment and with a political opportunity to try and build a better society after the outbreak, we need to use that time to try and reform the private rental sector for the better.
Thanks very much, James. Over to you, David.
Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon now. Yes, I'm Director of Enforcement at Waltham Forest, housing EHO by background and trade. Very happy that where I am, I've also got in my department trading standards, ASB, and all other services which contribute to dealing with the overall resolution of housing issues. I think we're very proud of Waltham Forest to have recently had approved another large-scale property licensing scheme, which covers most of the borough. Really pleased that we've made the case successfully to government, and we've achieved that. I think really interested in the conversation so far, how many of the speakers referred to resources and the issue of having the resources available to enforce the powers we've got. You know, we do recognise that we have got some quite strong powers. Sometimes the powers aren't necessarily that joined up and particularly strategic, but you know, I'm quite clear we can't enforce those powers without resources, and large-scale property licensing has given us the resources to have a significant proactive enforcement capability, a capability which most other or many other London boroughs have not got. So that's just really a short introduction. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to ask Caitlin to give us a few introductory words.
Yeah, thank you all very much for having me today. I'm from Generation Rent, we're the national voice of private renters. It's been really good to hear everyone's contribution so far. I think this report's so important specifically because, you know, by its nature, this sector operates in the shadows and is so difficult to track and trace. And at Generation Rent, we know that the worst landlords exist as tenants report it to us, but so far I think we found there's been a real lack of data on this, and so I'm glad that this report is shining a light on that. And I think from what we've heard so far as well, it does demonstrate that legislation needs to be designed with the worst end of the sector in mind, because otherwise, you know, it won't be relevant or fit to stop this kind of behaviour. I think a really good example of this is the eviction ban, which is something we called for in a piece of legislation that has helped a huge number of tenants. But unfortunately, you know, we've heard that illegal evictions have been continuing throughout COVID. And so unless we put in place measures to stop this, it will continue. And I think, you know, while this problem has existed for a while, as Ben said, the problems are really specific to the current political context. And so I think listening to everyone, what came through for me is the need really to end Section 21 so that tenants are less vulnerable to retaliatory eviction at this end, and also, you know, to improve the amount of intelligence on the sector. Something Generation Rent has been calling for is a national register of landlords, so at least you'd know who, you know, some of the good ones are, and be able to better track the worst ones, as well as more resources. But I am looking forward to hearing the questions and discussing this further. So yeah, thank you for having me.
Marvellous, thank you very much. And finally, Norris.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Karen. I suppose I'm slightly the odd one out on the panel insofar as I represent the National Residential Landlords Association. So we're a membership body for private residential landlords, predominantly in England and Wales. We're the largest representative body for that cohort, but I would say we only represent a little shy of 90,000 individuals and companies. So when you consider that in the context of more than 2 million declared landlords in the country, it's a relatively small proportion of what's out there. I suppose I really welcome the opportunity to talk about this report, and the opportunity to, well, I welcome the report full stop, because it's part of the sector that we as an organisation don't necessarily come into contact with as often as, well, we don't want to because we don't want to be there, but as often as we could to understand what's happening in this shadow sector. We're a voluntary organisation. We're an organisation that members join, you know, off their own backs. They're not compelled to do so, and therefore we like to think we're somewhat self-selecting. And I think on that basis, we'd support an awful lot of what's in this report, and I particularly like the 4 asks that Ben was talking about a little while ago. You know, I like the focus on the enforcement. I like the focus on sanctions, because, you know, to pick up on something I think Caitlin said a moment ago, our view would be actually, a lot of the legislation is fairly well designed. What's not fit for purpose is the enforcement. There's a disconnect between what we want, or what policymakers want to see in legislation, and what actually happens when it's implemented out there. Mostly, I would have thought, because of resources, but potentially because there's just not that joined up thinking about how it will work in reality. So I hope we'll get to some of that today.
Fantastic. It's a very welcome contribution. Thank you very much. So I'm going to have pick up some of the questions now, including to our other speakers. And for administrative reasons, I think it's easier for the questions actually processed through Molly and Elliot. So I'm going to let them take over the sharing out of the questions, and I'll be dipping in back in a few minutes.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Karen, and thanks to all the speakers and the panelists for taking the time to be here and share your thoughts on the report. So we're going to start off with questions for Will Tanner, just because he needs to leave soon. So I'm going to combine, there's some similar questions, so going to combine a couple of those, but these for Will. So Will, you mentioned, this is from Portia Mismang, apologies if I've butchered your name, but you mentioned a regular property MOT and a property ID, and with which digital platforms and portals would require. All good, but as we know, bait and switch is common. That's just one example, which leads me to doubt whether such measures would address the known issues in the bottom 10% of the PRS. Do you think that the measures you mentioned would actually make any difference in the shadow PRS? And kind of similar questions around to what extent we could expect the PRS market to regulate itself. And then there was one other question, slightly different, which was from Rona Brown. I'd like to ask Will if he has any insight into the current government's priorities with regard to private renters beyond the measures that have been put in place to support renters through the pandemic.
Okay, well, so thank you very much, and I apologise for having to kind of slope off a few minutes early. My main point in my remarks was that I think we need to distinguish between proposals and kind of policies which, in principle, sound good and might in principle be the right things to do, and things which are actually going to be effective. I think we have a kind of a long history across many policy areas of responsibilities actually often not being the most effective way of delivering large-scale behavioural change in complex markets and kind of environments such as the private rented sector, and that there's a reason why in most private markets we rely on kind of licensing and kind of authorization and identification rather than kind of hard regulatory measures, and that's why I've always been kind of quite supportive of some of the proposals that Julie and others have put forward of kind of market-based proposals for regulation, so licensing and ID. You're totally right that that type of action won't stamp out everything. But if you put a responsibility on OpenRent, Airbnb, other lettings platforms to check against a government database, which could be done very straightforwardly at very little cost to those platforms, effectively every listing was relating to a real property against a land registry database, for example, and that every property every listing related to a property that had been checked regularly for a property MOT, like exists through DVLA and the kind of vehicle licensing regime. I think you could create a very low-cost, non-bureaucratic way to check the vast majority of property listings very quickly, to such an effect that all of the platforms would adopt it, and it would probably prevent a large amount of abuse very quickly. I think the risk with some of the statutory responsibilities that have been proposed is not that they're not the right thing, but just they'll take a very long time to have effect, perhaps require quite a large amount of resource to enable them to have an effect, and rely very much on local authorities and police officers and tech platforms prioritizing this type of activity over other things, which may happen, but I would suggest that history suggests it doesn't necessarily happen. When I was in the Home Office trying to get the police and local authorities to deal with modern day slavery in their jurisdictions, it was an uphill battle. That was people not just in criminal kind of properties, but being kind of enslaved for little or no wages, completely in the shadows, and that was an issue that was right at the top of the media agenda, and it was still very, very difficult to get the police and local authorities to kind of stand up and take responsibility for that action. So I'm basically trying to be pragmatic and recognise that kind of broad-based licensing changes might have rapid effect over a large scale of the problem, not solving all of it, but solving a large amount of it in relatively short order. And I think they would also bluntly go with the political grain of a relatively liberal conservative government that is more attuned to kind of market-based policy rather than heavy regulation. So it's more likely to get through a significant majority government as well. With regard to the current government's policies, I mean, I can't speak to this very much other than to say that it's clear that this government is more concerned with helping people to achieve home ownership than they are with the private rented sector, and they've made clear their priority for home ownership. But that doesn't mean that they don't care about security in the housing market. And the kind of conversations that I have with ministers and MPs often focuses on the need to kind of focus on security full stop rather than security through one form of tenure, and to build security into more insecure forms of tenure like the private rented sector. And I guess we are talking currently about the most insecure type of tenure in the housing market, and the area where the most security needs to be built in. So I think that is a message that does resonate with government. They've obviously set out their plans for Section 21, which I think is a big step for a Conservative government. And as I said, when I was in government, there was a lot of resistance to that idea. And they also have talked about professionalising the lettings industry, which I would hope would be based on some of the digital tools that I've suggested and that Julie and others have previously championed. But I can't speak to any more detail than that, I'm afraid.
Thank you very much, Will.
Yeah.
Thank you for joining us. I've got a question for Lacey, but before I go on to that, would anybody like to come in on this and comment quickly? I'll move on in that case. Lacey, there have been lots of comments thanking you for your really inspiring testimony, and there's one question specifically from Jennifer Harris asking what would have made the biggest difference in helping you to improve your housing situation?
Thank you for acknowledging the experiences, because like these are things that I've shared when I've gone to officials and like gone to, you know, the council or agencies or what have you, and not had much positive feedback. So even just to hear the discussion, hearing, you know, the correct terms for the things that I've, you know, discussed amongst friends, and thinking like, couldn't this change? Couldn't that change? And if they had this, if there was somebody able to advocate, if there were resources for advocacy for those of us who have experience like dealing with difficult landlords and having a space where landlords have to answer to, I don't know, like an authority of sorts, a way of mediating. I know some of these things exist, but it seems to be really fragmented. And a lot of the time when I would call, you would hear that there's a lack of resource. So I don't know what can be done in terms of like raising funds or better training and things like this. But for me, I feel like had my initial vulnerabilities been adequately responded to, it wouldn't have been such an ongoing thing, because I've really carried this thing that it's a me issue. You know, it's something wrong with me, why I wasn't able to get it right. You know, I'd be working full time and then having to do toss-ups between childcare and rent. And that same, you know, the same property where I was receiving the death threats or what have you, the same agent had set up another friend of mine, like someone I became friends with after the incident, where money was stolen. They're paying rent to this agency, and apparently this agent has run off with the money. My friend still got evicted. I still ended up getting illegally evicted, but nothing happened to the agent. And now I have like a CCJ off the back of that, on top of all of that. And it's not, you know, I've spoken to the council and things like this, and there's not been any acknowledgement of that. It's just been kind of descripted as though, you know, well, your first property, you left it, so we can't help you. It's crazy to me. And I understand as an adult, like I'm supposed to be able to function in this society and create a life for myself, but there's all of these loopholes and cracks that I seem to be stumbling on all the time, and I don't know. I can hear the possibility of resolve from the dialogue that I'm hearing now. It's just seeing how it all connects. I feel like the answers are there. It's just seeing how it unfolds now, if that makes sense. Sorry.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Lacey. And I just also want to echo so many people who have in the chat and the Q&A thanked you for giving your testimony as well, and for sharing your thoughts. It's a really much needed input that you're bringing to the launch. Perfect. So we'll move on to some of these are general questions, so unless specified, anybody's free to jump on to answer these questions. So we'll start with a question from Phil Warren, who says, is part of the problem in getting police involvement in illegal evictions that they are too under-resourced and to respond, largely as a result of the huge policing cuts introduced by Theresa May? Yeah, feel free to...
Can I briefly jump on?
Yeah, go ahead, Raz.
It was mentioned earlier by Tom that we at Safer Renting have been involved, because we've been campaigning somewhat about the issue about police dealings with illegal evictions when they're called to it for as long as we've been in existence, and we've had some really, really positive progress in working through Tom with the Met, as he mentioned. One of the things I would say is I have absolutely no doubt that the Met and maybe policing nationally is being stretched to the limit or even beyond the limit. But one thing I think needs to be stressed is that very often the police are called to illegal evictions, and they often as not do turn up. What they've historically been doing is making the wrong advice and not intervening. What we've managed to achieve in very short order, without any particular increase in resources, but just through training and collaboration, is that the police turn up, as they did before, and all they need to do is to say, just stop it, otherwise we will have to arrest you because what you're proposing to do is illegal. And really that doesn't take an awful lot more, it probably takes less resources to do that and get a good preventative win than it does to give out the wrong advice. So I don't think it's just a simple question of resources. Resources, yes, that is part of the background, but I don't think that the resourcing challenge is any good reason not to make progress on delivering training and getting improved practice. And I really celebrate what Tom's managed to get the Met to pull off recently, because it really is beginning to pay dividends in North East London, as I'm sure Dave Beach will agree.
I just have to add to that as well, as I was designing the course, but the 1,000 officers that Tom mentioned who've done it within the first 6 weeks are mainly in the North East sector, which is Waltham Forest, and Safer Renting works across 7 different London boroughs. And we've had 8 times since then that tenants of ours have had to call the police, and 8 times they've turned up and done the right thing, including arresting the landlord in one case. In other boroughs where they haven't done the training, we're still getting refusals to attend, still getting situations where they're saying it's a civil matter. 8 times. Well, if you get illegally evicted in Waltham Forest, call the police straight away.
Caitlin, did you want to come in on this?
I was going to echo what's mainly been said already, that we're very aware that I think training's more of an issue than resources necessarily. We've heard of police officers actually assisting illegal evictions in some cases, sort of helping the landlord to change the locks and sort of carry out the illegal eviction. And so Generation Rent is definitely calling on police and crime commissioners to commit to training around illegal eviction, because I think, as Roz said, it's not once you have training, it's not a huge amount that needs to be done to make sure that people are sort of kept in their homes. So that's something we'll be working on over the next few months.
Can I just come in here briefly to add to say that I think this conversation highlights a broad issue around awareness of rights and understanding of what rights exist. Not obviously in relation to the police, as the discussion has been focused so far, but also around council officers. Just because of historic reasons or specific circumstances in individual boroughs, certain councils might be better resourced to help private renters than others, and there's a lot of stuff which can be done there just in terms of learning from each other about how to use the powers which are available more effectively. There's also the question about tenants knowing their rights, limited though they are, as even exist under the current legislation, in that quite often tenants don't even wait to receive formal Section 21 notice. Hear from the landlord, you've got to go, and they think that's it, and they don't necessarily know what their rights are in terms of the time period over which the notice has to be given and so on. I think all of that is important, but it shouldn't be a reason for us to shy away from the need to push for change to those fundamental rights as well. As in, I don't think this is just an issue about people being better informed about the rights that exist currently. I think the rights for tenants need to improve as well.
I'll just have a few words.
Go ahead, David.
Yeah, just to say that when we launched our first borough-wide licensing scheme, I think our members were very wary about doing more enforcement and the possible ramifications on tenants in terms of being more evictions and so on. And very much recognised that sort of dedicated TRO resources have tend to disappear from a lot of authorities. So we linked up with Cambridge House right at the beginning of the scheme in 2016. I think through the GLA, I think Cambridge House came and did a presentation to the GLA partnership meeting then. I think since then there's gradually been an increase in boroughs taking on Cambridge House's services. So I think that kind of we were very clear we wanted a resource where we could actually go out and meet people in the field and actually intervene in the field rather than getting to expect to come to an office in Walthamstow somewhere. So I think I just encourage other boroughs to have that facility there for their assistance as well, really.
We've actually got a question from Al McLenaghan for David and Ben, which is very similar, so I would just go on to that quickly to see if you had anything else you wanted to add. What might be the reasons that other local authorities have not imposed a system such as Waltham Forest to manage their PRS and licensing schemes and civil penalties, and what could be done to encourage this approach to be used by other boroughs?
I'm happy to kick off if that's okay. I think firstly, it's not an easy journey. One thing I was going to say was, there was a report, an independent report carried out on property licensing back in June 2019, which is on the government's website. The government haven't actually issued a formal response to that. I think the report generally found that licensing was, had a lot of positive impacts, that there were some improvements that need to be carried out. We haven't had the government's full response to that so far. I think there are a lot of hurdles to overcome. I think you need the political and the officer buy-in to push the schemes through. Evidence is key. But in terms of the other arm of that, which was civil penalties, I'm quite clear that again, there's no point in having civil penalties there if you haven't got the resources to enforce it, and therefore everything really, in my view, comes back to the strategic importance of licensing. I'm clear that all the other, a lot of the other powers that are out there outside licensing, none of them require landlords to proactively manage and maintain their properties. It's all reactive. Licensing is the only thing through license conditions which actually places proactive obligations on landlords to have a less hands-off approach to managing their properties. So, and the vast majority of action we take through civil penalties is on the back of property licensing. If you haven't got property licensing, one, you don't have the resources. Two, you have much less power to actually intervene with the powers that are available.
And I suppose to answer the other bit of Al's question, it's just for years I've been messianic about multi-agency working, because I used to work in Lewisham Council. Ros and I were running the multi-agency Rugg landlord task force that we put together, which wasn't a case of having a massive influx of money like Newham did to jumpstart their scheme, but they just got everyone to work together. We worked smarter, not harder. We isolated landlords and their properties, and we all planning enforcement, environmental health, everyone who's involved targeted those properties. And I remember a journalist that I know put in a FOI request when the scheme wound down and said, in the 2 years leading up to the creation of the multi-agency approach at Lewisham, how many prohibition orders did the council serve? And it was 9. And then he said, okay, in the 2 years that pilot scheme was operating, how many did you do? And it was 83. And we did that without necessarily taking on extra staff, but just by making sure that all the teams were involved in it. And multi-agency is the thing. I feel really strongly about this. When councils don't do a multi-agency approach to rogue landlords and criminal activities in the pre-RS, you're letting them walk. You're missing an opportunity, because they can play planning off against environmental health, against licensing, against homelessness. When everyone is involved, there's no way for them to hide. They're getting letters from everyone. Ros and I have long had this motto with criminal landlords: if they're doing one thing, they're doing everything. All you need to do is find housing benefit fraud or meter tampering, and you know they're going to be doing everything else as well. So we go out with our work with David's team at Waltham Forest. We did it the other day. So they identify a property that needs a license and hasn't got one, and then the next thing that happens, as I indicated in my presentation, is that the harassment and the legal eviction starts. But by being with them at root with a different legal discipline, we can pick it up before the landlord even starts. So we've got our hands on the people, which is the best way of having a safety net. Anyone can do that, but there is, as Dave said, you have to get the political will behind the cultural will, and some people in enforcement teams of different local authorities just don't see that yet, but it is changing a lot. It is.
If I could come in quickly on that, sorry.
I just wanted to add quickly on the licensing point, sorry, as well. The other dimension is, of course, and I went through this again, Lewisham Connection on Lewisham Council recently put together a huge amount of evidence to support their bid for a licensing scheme. But of course, at the end of the day, the Secretary of State can say no. And you can do all of that work and put together all that evidence, and the minister in Whitehall can go, actually, no, you can't have a borough-wide scheme, or we're going to limit it down. And, you know, years ago, they used to talk about localism. Well, there isn't very much localism in that, and I do think it's a bit ridiculous that local authorities don't have the ability to get on and do this themselves without having a minister in Whitehall tick a box.
So I was just going to add previously, just to endorse all of what Ben was saying, there's nothing that frustrates the rest of the market, the good landlords, more than seeing the criminal operators in our marketplace get away with things because they know the system. And sometimes it seems like they know the system better than the system knows itself. They know who to play off against each other. I mean, the question mark that I would raise, or the question I would raise about licensing, and particularly when we're talking about borough-wide licensing, is why the only seemingly available opportunity to fund the kind of enforcement we need is via licensing. Now, the pushback that you'll get from a lot of good landlords is the ones that you want to get, the ones who are operating in the shadow sector or at the bottom of the market, never engage with the licensing scheme. Now, you can suggest that means that there's a focus on them because they're the ones who don't buy into it, but actually it's asking for the rest of the market to fund the focus on them. I think what I'd like to see is resourcing being made available so the only option to a borough isn't imposing a licence scheme that may be designed for something else. And then the licensing schemes can be targeted where there is a demonstrable problem, rather than trying to blanket an entire borough. Now, I may be the only member of the panel who's of that opinion. I completely accept that. But I think we'd really like to see that licensing, particularly where it's selective licensing, used, as the name says, selectively to target the absolute worst.
I'll just say something briefly on that. I mean, I think, it is selective licensing for a reason, and we haven't got an absolute borough-wide scheme at the moment. We've got 2 wards which aren't included, which didn't meet the test. But I think we're here today to talk about the shadow rented sector, and I think the report touches upon this. But there are a huge number of landlords out there who are non-compliant, for want of a better word, which don't really fall within that, the shadow PRS. Our estimate is we've got over 20% of our PRS have got significant housing hazards in there, and so this isn't just an issue which affects a small minority of properties in Waltham Forest. It actually affects a big proportion. And as I said before, unfortunately, with the legislation we have at the moment, licensing is the only thing that actually there's actually a requirement on landlords to proactively manage their properties, because none of the other stuff is preventative. All the other legislation is reactive. So that's what I've got to say on that.
Great, thank you. So I think the next question we're going to have is from Tessa Shepperson, which is an open question. If the duty to pay compensation is moved from the public to the landlord, presumably for things like Protection from Eviction Act, would this mean that the tenant will lose out if it proves impossible to get the landlord to actually pay this money?
That's a definite risk. If I can come in on that. I mean, we'd certainly support the polluter pays principle, insofar as there is no reason for the state to pick up where a landlord has knowingly and deliberately allowed a property to deteriorate to the point where the state's got to step in even. But I think Tessa raises a good point. I think if you've got these individuals who have built avoidance or evasion into their business model, have built sanctions into their business model, they are probably exactly the type of individuals and businesses who are going to be very good at evading any pursuit for that money.
I think another part of that question, I know Ros, do you want to say, I know what you're going to say, you're going to say the same thing, Ros, go on, you do it.
You can add on if I miss something.
Okay,
I think there are two connected parts to that. We had another recommendation, which is that we really want legislation to be amended so that the smoke and mirrors is not so easy to play. And alongside the reform of the lettings industry, we want to see it becoming an obligation on the owner of a property to know what is being done in their name and with their asset. And to that extent, we think, although we're not civil servants and we're not drafting legislation here, but we believe that the principle that there should be strict joint and several liability on the owner for when there are housing offences committed, that would be the pathway through which a compensation payment under the Land Compensation Act would point itself at the asset itself. Now, I fully recognise that in practical terms, it's a lot harder to get a charging order on a property and then get that converted into either a forced sale or in some way getting the compensation out. But we think that there would be ways of doing it, and that it's linked very much to that. Let's not let the owner of the property, who in the end has got to either has got to have due diligence to make sure that they're not being involved in crimes without them knowing about it, because they should. And also that their asset is the thing that's driving all of this at the end of the day, and that's where the person who's been a victim of an offence should be able to look for compensation.
And there's a precedent for that to an extent. Last year, we assisted Kent Police Serious Crime Squad, who came to us and they said that they noticed every time that they went to a property that was being run as a brothel or used for people trafficking, there was a letting agent involved. And the letting agent always proclaimed innocence. But what they were looking to do, and I don't know where we've left it since then, is to use Section 45 of the Serious Crime Act 2015 to treat enablers as, letting agents in those instances as enablers of crime. Now, they would say we're nothing to do with this, but the law says you don't have to be a member of a gang. You don't have to be benefiting from the criminal activity directly, but the fact that you had control of the property means that you should have known, and that makes you an enabler of crime. So there's something of that logic that transfers, and also just what we see all the time with that everyone blaming everyone else, and limited companies phoenixing their company when you get anywhere near them to make the asset the backstop. And in a normal case with other things as well, if the owner of the property feels unfairly treated in that way, it's up to them to go after the people who've created the situation.
Can I just also just say at this point, I think it's really important, I think, to sort of distinguish between this kind of quite organised criminality and the general sort of understandings of how we want the PRS to run, because the two need quite different policy responses. The kind of ways in which we need the statutory authorities to respond to very highly organised criminality in the PRS, they need a high level of resource, a high level of commitment, greater support from the courts and from the police. All of these things need to be brought into play, because we're talking about people who are very well organised often, have multiple properties across boroughs, and as everyone says, play local authorities against each other. And they're not unknown to the authorities, but the authorities just find it really hard to deal with that level of criminality and that degree of organised criminality. And I think one of the strengths of the report is to say, you know, we're talking about something that's on a different scale here. It's not just a landlord forgetting to give you a tenancy agreement. We're talking about something that's very well organised, and where we need for the police to start taking this perhaps a little bit more seriously than they do. Because often, I think, as Ben was saying, if they're doing one thing, they're doing a lot of other things as well. You know, they're also going to be defrauding tax. They're going to be involved in all sorts of other kind of activities, often that really link to a number of different types of criminal behaviour. The good thing about letting kind of criminality is that there's a property. And I think it's interesting, you know, to say, as Ros and Ben say, you can always go back to find who owns the property and create a kind of a foundation for prosecution. But I think it's easy to get distracted, and I'm not saying this is not important, to think about what do we want the PRS to look like. But it's a separate question to think, how can we police criminality in the lettings industry? Because it's a slightly different question, and it's definitely one that needs a much, much more joined up response, and a response that we're really still not seeing, I don't think, from the government.
Thank you, everybody.
A related point to this discussion, which is about making sure that if you have local councils, local authorities considering taking enforcement action against landlords over the property that they're letting, it feels to me in many cases the balance of where the cost of that falls is wrong at the moment, and may discourage councils in some cases from taking enforcement action. And I've got a very particular example in my mind, which is a few years old, but it's still relevant, which is when I, 2 jobs ago, when I was working at Islington Council, when I was executive member for housing there was a case where a landlord had subdivided a building into rooms that were all substandard and basically were not allowed to be rented out. Enforcement action was taken against the landlord, saying you're not allowed to rent those properties out, but that then meant there were a dozen or more tenants, many of whom were quite vulnerable, were suddenly being made homeless. In that case, the council felt responsibility to step in and help them, although there wasn't a statutory duty in most cases, you know, just to help them to try and find somewhere to go on. But that caused, you know, that took a huge amount of resource from the council to help people in that case, basically helping people who had been on the receiving end of very bad behaviour, in this case, by the landlord. That was all a cost to the council. And in terms of sheer capacity of the council, I remember a discussion about how many of these could we do at one time, because it takes all of the capacity, spare capacity that the council had to help people, the tenants who were affected by that situation. So I think when we're talking about enforcement, where the fallout from enforcement lands, we have to bear in mind that, you know, it should not fall on tenants. And if councils and or the other enforcement authorities are going to be concerned about the impact on their capacity, you don't want them to have to think twice about whether to enforce or not. So making sure that the landlord in that case takes an appropriate responsibility for paying for the fallout is going to be quite crucial.
Thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to interrupt because we've just got to 1 o'clock and we do have a lot more questions to answer. One thing that somebody's mentioned is there going to be a downloadable link for the report? The report is now actually available on Cambridge House's website, which is ch1889, and we'll send around the link for people to download that. It is now 1 o'clock, as I say, which is when we're due to finish, but we have lots more questions. Are people wanting to carry on? Are people available to carry on? Because anything that we do have left over, we're basically going to commit to getting responses and putting them on our website as well.
Yeah, I think we'll do one more question and then Karen can wrap up. But yeah, and we'll make sure that any remaining questions get answered on our website as well.
Cool. So I have another question from John Wilson, who would like to ask, Karen, if you're around, Ben mentioned that the boom in rent prices has attracted criminal activity. Is it recognised that affordability is a problem across the PRS as a whole, and are there plans to argue for rent controls?
Thanks very much. Well, the issue of affordability is absolutely totally understood, rooted both in some cases in a mixture of rents and, of course, the deliberate decision to reduce the support that was been available from through the social security system to pay for rent over years, which was has been partly listed in the context of the COVID crisis. It's not me for me to speak for the Labour Party's housing spokesperson, Thangam, who is working on this, but I can refer you to the report that I worked with James Murray on, and obviously with Tom in his new capacity as Deputy Mayor for the Mayor of London, which looked at the issue of rent controls in London and what's necessary in order to make progress on the issue of rents. And that is a report that is also available on the GLA website. So I do strongly advise you to have a look at that, because it was a very solid piece of work that looked at the issue of affordability, particularly in the context of place where affordability is the acute issue.
Yeah, and I think for my part, everyone we see, the affordability is at the heart of it. I made the comment about people being journeys in the private rented sector rather than journeys through, because people don't get out, and what keeps them there is the lack of affordability. It's always people in really, really small income jobs, and they just can't get out. They just go from one to the other. Lack of that income just keeps you tied in that sector, and it's a terrifying place to be. There's just no way out of it if you've got no choices, and there's an army of people willing to exploit the most vulnerable people and to just treat all the kind of things they do to me is just a tax on your desperation. I always think of it, really. You can't afford anything else. People know they don't get given rent receipts when they pay their rent. If they raise a problem, they just get thrown out. They ask for a tenancy agreement. Well, you're not in a position to ask for one, is what happens to them. And it's all down to affordability. Rent control, I don't know. Ask my heart what I think of rent control, and I'm virulently pro really eye-watering rent control, if you were to ask my heart. If you were to ask my head as a housing professional, well, there's so many different versions of it, restricted rents, and I'm not up on all of the different types of rent control that are out there. But I certainly think rent control is essential on the personal level. It's an essential component of rogue and criminal landlord behaviour.
Can I just add to that very briefly that I think there's an inevitable connection between whether or not rents are affordable and what you get for that money, because there's a limit to what working people can afford. And a lot of the people that we've seen and talked about in our report are not on benefits. They're low paid workers. There's a limit on what they can afford. There's a lack of supply. And as night follows day, that means that there's shrinkflation in the market, where people are just giving less and less for the same money or more money. And so the housing standards are going, and that's what we've seen driving the massive spread in unlawful, unlicensed HMOs. And there is not an effective floor on space and amenity standards. So you've got to either address one or the other. If you don't address either, preferably both, but if you don't address them one or the other, then you're going to have an increasing chronic crisis.
If I could just add one point on rent controls, I mean, it'll come as no surprise to anyone that the landlord body on the table isn't in favour of rent controls. I mean, I'd say two very, very quick points around that. Firstly, I completely agree that affordability is an issue that we need to talk about, we need to debate. But affordability is a function of two things, not just the rent, it's also the income. And I think we do need to be looking at what is a reasonable income for people, particularly in a city like London, where the affordability issue is really, really sharp. I think secondly, if we are talking about affordability and also the standards of maintenance and management of properties, providing good quality accommodation costs money, and restricting what a landlord can charge for that without taking into account what it costs to provide that housing is not going to improve the quality of stock or the quality of maintenance or the quality of management that we see. So I completely understand emotionally why rent control is something that comes up an awful lot. I completely understand why there's an argument to be made around that. I would say that please do look at the costs of providing that accommodation as well, though, across the piece.
Perfect. I think on that note, we will have to leave it there. There are so many excellent questions left unanswered, unfortunately, but we will definitely make sure that the questions that are remaining are answered by the panelists, and those answers circulated to all attendees. So they will eventually get answered. So I'll now pass over to Karen back to close ceremonies.
Thanks very much. I'm not going to attempt to summarise all of the excellent contributions and the response to questions, but just a few points that have really struck me from listening over the last couple of hours. I mean, firstly, just picking up on Will made about these issues having always been with us. To which I would think up to a point. I mean, we have gone in cycles over not just decades but centuries in terms of the conditions that students have lived in and how those problems have been responded to. But it was very forcefully, I think, countered by the argument, I think, from Ben, but Ros and others, that we are in a new situation at the moment. I think it was in the PowerPoint presentation, which would be good to have circulated, as well as the link, by the way, for people who are interested. But that situation we are now in with the criminal landlord sector in the shadow PRS is not the same in 2020 as it was in 1990 or in the 70s or in the era of Rackman and Hoogstraten. It changes. The nature of the problem changes and the nature of the response changes. And there have been responses in the past, and those responses have never been perfect. They have worked. Legislative changes, the development of the social housing sector as a counter, the growth of the social housing sector as a counter to the worst of the PRS for the most vulnerable, for people who are in greatest need. And we can do that again. We can come up with a range of responses that will meet these new challenges. A second point, which was in a way a kind of a tension that I think we have to continue to explore a little, is Caitlin made the point about the framework law having to deal with the worst part of the private rented sector, and I think Julie was bringing on that too, that we need a framework that recognises that criminal landlords and the shadow rented sector are not are not the same as the rest of the private rented sector, and need responses, legislative responses and resource responses that allow us to drill down into those particular challenges. And yet at the same time, there isn't necessarily always a kind of absolutely hard border between those sectors. And David made the point well that there is the criminal element of the private rented sector, but also then a larger pool of properties that are substandard, that are not well managed, and that also provide real challenge to certainly for the people who live in them, but for the enforcement agencies as well. So whilst we may need a targeted package of measures to deal with the worst of the sector, it should sit within a wider framework of legislative change and greater capacity to respond to the PRS overall. The third point, which Julie made strongly, was around the kind of lack of information, which some of our arguments are resting. We don't know how many illegal evictions take place. We probably never will entirely, but there's certainly a lot of information that we don't have. We don't have just about the private rented sector overall, and David made the point about the fact that the NRLA only represents 90,000 or so landlords out of around 2 million. And it's very good that the NRLA here and welcoming this report, and that's something that I welcome. But it's also the case that that those responsible group of landlords don't want to be tainted with the behaviour of the criminal element of the shadow, but a huge pool of landlords. What they're doing, how they're acting, is something that is not known to us. And the final point is around capacity. We need legislative change, and we have very solid proposals for legislative change sitting over and above issues like abolishing Section 21. But we have to have capacity in local government. We have to have police capacity, whether that's training or additional help, but also there are wider issues like legal aid, advocacy and representation for tenants. Who, as coming back to the very beginning, it is the most vulnerable tenants, those with the least choice, the least power, who find themselves trapped in the worst part of the sector and at greater risk from the criminal behaviour of the worst landlords. So it just remains me to thank Lacey in particular for her very powerful living testimony at the beginning of this session, and that her story and those like it we must never lose sight of. To thank all of our speakers and all of our panel members for their contributions, which were absolutely brilliant. The authors of the report and Molly and Elliot for helping manage this session and put it all together, and also the University of York Centre for Housing Policy and the Trust for London, who have been whose support has made a report and this session possible. We will have the Renters' Rights Act. We will have an opportunity to move forward legislatively, and we want to see how we can take these recommendations into legislation, make the case for government. And just going back to Lacey, we have a moral obligation to people in this situation, but it's also in all our self-interest too. We cannot afford the consequences on homelessness and on other pressures of allowing the criminal landlord sector to get away with it. So we will take this forward, and we will act together to the government to respond to the recommendations in this report. Thank you all very much for being here.
Thank you.